Have you ever noticed how grief has a taste? For me, it was the bitter, metallic flavor of a truth I wasn't ready to swallow. It coated my tongue the moment my plane descended over the rolling hills of Napa Valley, a patchwork of greens and golds that I once called home. The California sun was as brilliant as ever, but it felt mocking, a spotlight on the gaping hole my father's absence had carved into the world. Blackwood Estate was more than a vineyard. It was my father's heart, translated into acres of gnarled vines and the rich scent of fermenting grapes. Now, that heart had stopped. The funeral was a blur of black suits, muted condolences, and the cloying scent of lilies fighting a losing battle against the earthy aroma of the soil Marcus loved. People said I had his eyes. They didn't know I also had his palate, a gift that allowed me to taste the truth in a wine, and the lie in a man's smile. My uncle David played the part of the grieving brother flawlessly. At 58, he still possessed the easy charm that had always made him the public face of the company, while my father was its soul. He moved through the crowd, a hand on a shoulder here, a somber nod there. But when his eyes met mine, I saw something that chilled me more than the damp air of the cellar. It wasn't sorrow. It was appraisal. The reading of the will took place the following day in a sterile office that smelled of old paper and finality. The lawyer droned on, his voice a monotone instrument of fate. I barely listened, lost in memories of my father teaching me to distinguish the notes of blackberry from blackcurrant in a Cabernet. Then, a single phrase sliced through my haze. And to my only daughter, Sofia, I bequeath my entire 50% ownership of Blackwood Estate. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. 50%. Half of everything. Half the legacy, half the struggle, half the soul. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a gift. It was a crown of thorns, a weight I had never been trained to carry. I was a sommelier, a storyteller of wine, not the author of its creation. What did I know about running a business of this magnitude? After the lawyer had packed his briefcase, David walked over to me. He wrapped his arms around my shoulders in an embrace that felt more like a cage than a comfort. His cologne was sharp, overpowering. "Don't you worry about a thing, kiddo," he murmured into my hair, his voice a smooth, reassuring baritone. "We'll manage this together, just like your father always wanted." I pulled back to look at him, searching for the uncle who used to sneak me sips of grape juice from the tasting barrels. I wanted to see shared grief, a promise of partnership. But what I found in his gaze was a flicker of something cold and sharp, like a shard of glass in a velvet pouch. It was the triumphant gleam of a game well played. In that moment, I understood a terrifying truth. My father was gone, and the man standing before me wasn't mourning a brother. He was calculating his next move. New York felt a million miles away, a life belonging to someone else. I told David I was staying for a few weeks to get into the swing of things, a vague corporate phrase that seemed to satisfy him. The truth was, his reassuring smile didn't reach those calculating eyes I'd seen at the will reading. That image was a splinter under my skin, and I couldn't leave until I'd worked it out. My professional life was built on detecting subtleties, and my instincts were screaming that something here was off-key. 3 days later, I asked for a full tasting of the last two vintages, the ones bottled since my father's illness had forced him to step back. "Of course," David said with a broad grin, "an expert opinion is always welcome." There was that tone again, the verbal pat on the head. He saw me as the sommelier, the performer, not the owner. He didn't seem to realize that my entire career was an extension of my father's obsession with perfection, a legacy I carried on my palate. The tasting room was my childhood temple, a space of vaulted ceilings and the cool, hallowed scent of oak and aging wine. I could still see my father standing by the main barrel, swirling a deep crimson liquid in his glass, his brow furrowed in concentration. He used to say that wine was bottled truth, a story of the sun, the soil, and the season. He would have sooner sold the land than bottle a lie. I ran my hand along the cool oak table, drew a deep breath, and prepared to listen to the stories these new bottles had to tell. The first few were familiar, comforting. A Sauvignon Blanc from 2 years ago, crisp with the notes of green apple and grapefruit he'd perfected. Then came the newer wines. I started with a Chardonnay from the last harvest. I swirled the pale gold liquid, held it to the light. On the nose, it was muted. Where I expected the creamy notes of butter and vanilla from a proper malolactic fermentation, there was only a thin, sharp hint of citrus. I took a sip. The wine was hollow, lacking the signature structure and complexity of a Blackwood vintage. It was technically correct, but soulless. I moved on to the Pinot Noir, my father's pride. It was always elegant, a delicate balance of red fruit and earthy undertones. But the one in my glass was flabby, the fruit notes tasting jammy and overripe. The finish short and unsatisfying. It was a wine trying to be something it wasn't. Batch after batch, the same dissonance emerged. The quality wasn't just inconsistent, it felt deliberately compromised, like a masterful painting that had been copied by a less talented student. It was almost right, but all the genius was gone. David found me staring at the lineup of half-empty glasses, my notes a mess of question marks. "Find any new favorites?" he asked, his voice booming with forced cheerfulness. I kept my own voice level, professional. "I'm noticing a significant deviation in the profile of the last few vintages, David. The structure is weaker, the finish is shorter. It doesn't taste like our fruit." I watched him closely, seeing how the muscles in his jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Ah, the artist's palette," he said, waving a hand in the air. "It was a bad year, honey, that's all. The late rains diluted the grapes. Every vineyard in the valley struggled." He delivered the line with such practiced ease that a less trained ear might have believed him, but I knew better. I knew my father. Marcus could coax magic from the most difficult years. He would have thinned the crop, worked tirelessly to save the harvest's integrity. He would never have bottled mediocrity and slapped the Blackwood label on it. He was blaming the weather, an act of God. It was the perfect, unimpeachable excuse. But I could taste the truth in the wine that lingered on my tongue. This wasn't the taste of a difficult season. This was the taste of a shortcut. And as David turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the silent, disappointing ghosts of vintages past, I knew with chilling certainty that the problem wasn't in the soil or the sky. The rot was somewhere much closer to home. David's excuse about a bad year echoed in my mind for days, a hollow and discordant note. It was too simple, too convenient. I spent my time walking the rows of vines, the very ones my father had planted with his own hands. I let the rough leaves brush against my fingers and crumbled the rich, dark soil between my palms, searching for a connection, for an answer. Was the truth hidden here, in the earth? Or was I just a grieving daughter chasing shadows in a place that no longer felt like home? I saw her near the old block of Zinfandel, her back to me. Elena. She'd been the head winemaker here for over 30 years, a quiet, formidable woman with hands permanently stained a deep purple brown. Her face was a roadmap of harvests, etched with the sun and worry of countless seasons. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, inspecting a cluster of grapes with a focus so intense the rest of the world seemed to fall away. She was loyal to two things: the integrity of the grape and the memory of my father. She must have sensed me approaching, because she straightened up slowly, her eyes, sharp and intelligent, finding mine. There was no artifice in her gaze, only a deep, weary sadness that mirrored my own. We stood in silence for a moment, the rustle of the vine leaves the only sound between us. It was in that shared silence that I knew I could trust her. She saw not just the new owner, but Marcus's daughter, and the weight of that legacy hung between us. "He wouldn't have bottled that Pinot," she said, her voice low and raspy, as if she were afraid the vines themselves were listening. She didn't need to say who he was. "Your father would have sold the juice to a bulk producer before he let a wine like that carry the Blackwood name." Her words were a balm on my raw instincts, the first external validation that I wasn't just imagining things. She had tasted the lie, too. Seeing the flicker of understanding in my eyes, she gestured for me to follow her deeper into the vineyard, away from the main buildings. "After Marcus got sick," she began, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "about a year ago, David started making strange decisions." She paused, choosing her words as carefully as she would choose grapes for a reserve blend. "Trucks started arriving at night. From other growers. Places your father would never buy from." My heart began to beat a heavy, painful rhythm against my ribs. What was she telling me? Was it possible the betrayal was this blatant, this cheap? "He's buying cheaper grapes from questionable suppliers," she said, the words coming out in a rush now. "He's mixing them with our harvest to increase the volume. Your father would have never, ever allowed it. It's poison to the estate's reputation, a lie in every bottle." There it was, the ugly, simple truth, laid bare in the shadow of the very vines my father had nurtured. It wasn't a bad year. It was a calculated deception. David wasn't just cutting corners. He was systematically dismantling my father's legacy from the inside out, replacing integrity with volume, quality with profit. He had smiled in my face and lied, counting on my grief to blind me. But he had forgotten one crucial thing. He had forgotten that I was my father's daughter, and I could taste the truth. Now, I just had to prove it. Elena's words had given my suspicion a spine. It was no longer a phantom haunting the edges of my thoughts, but a solid, ugly thing with a name: fraud. But a winemaker's accusation and a sommelier's palate weren't proof. For that, I needed to go to the place where all business truths and lies are ultimately recorded. I needed the books. How do you ask a wolf to see his bookkeeping on the sheep farm? You do it with a smile, pretending you're only there to count the flock. I found David in the main office, reviewing shipping manifests. I leaned against the doorframe, projecting an air of casual, slightly overwhelmed inheritance. "David," I began, my voice pitched to sound more like a student than a partner. "If I'm going to be of any real use here, I need to understand the financial side of things. Could I get access to the books for the last year or so? I want to see the real guts of the operation." I watched a muscle feather in his jaw. It was the only sign of his hesitation. His charming smile snapped back into place almost instantly. "Ambitious. I like it. But are you sure you want to bore yourself with spreadsheets, Sofia? It's not exactly as romantic as tasting wine." He was patronizing me again, trying to keep me in my designated box. "I want to learn," I said, my voice firm but friendly. "Dad always said you can't understand the wine without understanding the business." Using my father against him was a low blow, but it worked. With a sigh that feigned reluctance, he gave me the password to the main server. "Knock yourself out," he said. That night, the winery was silent except for the hum of the cooling units. I walked into my father's office and closed the door, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud. The air was thick with his memory, the faint scent of aged paper, leather, and the ghost of his cigar smoke. I sat in his oversized chair, the worn leather cool against my skin. For a moment I was paralyzed by the feeling of trespassing, of violating a sacred space. But then I remembered the hollow taste of that Pinot Noir. This wasn't a violation, it was a reclamation. I started with the official ledgers on the server. For hours, I traced the flow of money, my eyes scanning line after line of numbers. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. The expenses were high, but plausible for a difficult harvest year. The profits were down, just as he'd claimed. It was a neat, tidy story of a business weathering a storm. But it felt wrong. The numbers didn't have the same flawed, compromised character as the wine in the bottles. Where were the receipts for the cheap grapes Elena had seen? My heart hammered against my ribs. Think, Sofia. Think. He's a performer. This clean ledger is his stage. The real action must be happening somewhere else. I started clicking through the server's directory, my search methodical. I looked in old archives, project folders, miscellaneous files. Then I saw it. A folder buried 3 levels deep, named simply contingencies. What a sterile corporate word for a secret. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked it open. It contained a single, password-protected spreadsheet. What would the password be? I tried his birthday, his dog's name, Blackwood. Nothing. Then I thought about his arrogance, his cynical view of my father. I typed in, dreamer. The file opened. It was a second set of books, a mirror image of the first, but twisted and distorted. The real story. My blood ran cold as I placed the 2 spreadsheets side by side on the wide monitor. I saw the real, lower costs. And then I saw the phantom invoices. There were charges for emergency vineyard consultations from a firm that a quick search revealed didn't exist. There were inflated bills for barrels, for bottles, for labels. And then, the final, devastating blow. A series of large, regular payments to a shell corporation called Napa Valley Logistics. It took me less than 5 minutes to find the company's registration online. The sole director was listed as David Thorne, my uncle. He wasn't just saving money by buying cheap grapes. He was systematically draining the company's lifeblood, funneling my father's legacy into his own pocket. And he had been doing it for the entire year my father was too sick to notice. I leaned back in the chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating my face. The room felt airless, suffocating. The grief I had carried for weeks was incinerated in a sudden, white-hot flash of rage. This office was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene. The man who had hugged me at the funeral, who had promised to help, was a parasite. He hadn't just betrayed his partner. He had robbed his own dying brother. And the proof of it was all right here, glowing in the dark. Sleep didn't come. How could it? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glowing columns of the spreadsheet, a digital testament to a year of methodical theft. The rage I'd felt had cooled overnight, solidifying into something harder and heavier. Purpose. There would be no quiet phone calls to lawyers, no cautious planning. This poison had to be lanced, and it had to be done now. What do you do when you discover the heart of your family is rotten? You cut it out. I spent the dawn in my father's office, printing out the evidence. The whisper and hum of the printer was the only sound, spitting out page after page of phantom invoices, inflated expenses, and the damning incorporation documents for Napa Valley Logistics. I laid them out on the polished surface of my father's desk, a neat, undeniable paper trail leading directly to his brother. The physical weight of the stack of paper felt good in my hands. It made the betrayal tangible. This wasn't a bad dream. It was a stack of evidence. I called his cell phone at 8 o'clock sharp. "David, can you come to Dad's office? I've found some things in the financials I don't understand." My voice was a marvel of control, a placid lake over a churning abyss. He agreed. a hint of amusement in his tone, as if he were indulging a child's game. 15 minutes later, he walked in, a coffee mug in his hand, his trademark charming smile already in place. "Burning the midnight oil, I see. What's so urgent?" I didn't stand up. I didn't offer him coffee. I simply gestured to the chair opposite the desk, the chair where my father's business partners, his rivals, and his friends had all sat. He was now all three. As he settled in, his smile faltered slightly, taking in the cold formality of the scene. I pushed the stack of papers across the desk. "This," I said, my voice as cold and clear as ice water. "I don't understand this." He picked up the first page, the one showing the payments to his shell company. I watched him, searching for any sign of panic, of shock, of shame. There was none. He slowly leafed through the pages, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to a kind of flat, clinical assessment. The charming mask didn't fall. It dissolved. It was a slow, terrifying transformation, like watching a wax figure melt, revealing the cold, hard armature beneath. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by that same calculating iciness I'd seen at the will reading. He set the papers down and leaned back in his chair, the picture of calm. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to justify it with lies. He looked me straight in the eye, and for the first time, I saw the real David. "Your father," he began, his voice devoid of all its previous warmth, "was a brilliant winemaker, an artist. But he was a terrible businessman. He was a dreamer, Sofia. He would have run this place into the ground with his sentimentality." I stared at him, speechless. He was confessing to grand larceny as if he were explaining a necessary but unpleasant quarterly report. "He refused to adapt, to make the hard choices," David continued, his voice gaining strength. "This valley is a battlefield, not a poet's society. I did what was necessary to keep us afloat, to ensure there was a business here for you to inherit at all. I made the decisions Marcus was too weak, too idealistic to make. The audacity of it, the sheer breathtaking arrogance, finally broke my paralysis." "The decisions?" I repeated, my voice shaking with a fury I could no longer contain. "You call systematic theft a decision? You were bleeding him dry while he was dying, David. You were creating fake companies and funneling his money, our money, into your own pocket. That's not business. That's a crime." He didn't even flinch. A small, cold smile touched his lips. "It's all a matter of perspective, isn't it?" he said softly. "You see a crime. I see survival. I see a legacy preserved, even if the methods were unorthodox." In that moment, I realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't sorry. He felt nothing. No guilt, no remorse, no shame. He believed with every fiber of his being that he was the hero of this story, the pragmatist who saved the dream from the dreamer. His mask was gone, and the monster he'd revealed was more terrifying than anything I could have ever imagined. His words hung in the office air, thick and toxic. Survival. He called this survival. For a dizzying second the world tilted and I tried to see it from his perspective. I tried to see the pragmatism, the hard choice he claimed he'd made, but all I saw was a thief justifying his crime. How do you negotiate with a man whose moral compass is a spinning broken needle? You don't. You expose him. I took a deep, steadying breath, the cold fury returning like a tide. "I'm glad you see it so clearly, David. It will make my statement to the district attorney that much simpler." I tapped the pile of printouts between us. "This, along with a full forensic audit, will tell a very compelling story. I'm sure the Napa Vintners Association will also be fascinated by your unorthodox methods." My voice was low and even, each word a carefully placed stone in the wall I was building around him. He didn't laugh. He didn't protest. He simply watched me, a strange, almost pitying look on his face, as if I were a naive child who had just stumbled upon a complex adult truth. He let the silence stretch, letting my threat echo in the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer defensive. It was the calm, instructional tone of a man explaining the rules of a game I didn't even know I was playing. "You think this is your winning hand, don't you?" He leaned forward, his polished charm now weaponized into a chilling condescension. "Let me explain what will happen, Sofia. Not what you hope will happen. The moment you file a single complaint, I will counter. As 50% owner and the managing partner who has personally guaranteed the winery's substantial loans, I will immediately file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy." He said the words, Chapter 11, as if they were a benediction, not a curse. My blood ran cold. I opened my mouth to speak, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. The company will be frozen. All assets, all accounts. We will be placed into receivership. And given the evidence you so proudly present of financial mismanagement, my mismanagement, you will claim, no bank will extend us a line of credit. We won't make it to restructuring. We will be forced to liquidate everything." He gestured vaguely toward the window, at the rolling hills and the endless rows of vines. "This land, this building, the barrels, the brand name your father spent his life building, it will all go up for auction. It will be sold for pennies on the dollar to our competitors, who will carve it up and erase the Blackwood name from the map forever. You will get nothing. Not a single cent." The room was silent. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart. Then he delivered the final killing blow, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And when it's all over, I will make sure everyone in this valley, every writer, every critic, every friend your father ever had, knows the story. They will know that Marcus Blackwood's legacy survived for 30 years, only to be destroyed in a matter of weeks by his own daughter's reckless, emotional crusade. You came here to be a hero, Sofia. I'll make sure you walk away, remembered as the destroyer." I stared at him, the stack of papers on the desk between us suddenly feeling as flimsy and useless as a handful of ash. He had taken my righteous anger, my undeniable proof, and twisted it into a weapon pointed directly at my father's heart. He had created an impossible choice: seek justice and annihilate the legacy, or allow a thief to prosper and preserve the name. He stood up, smoothing his jacket. "The choice is yours," he said, and walked out, leaving me alone in the silent, suffocating tomb of my father's office. Have you ever been handed a truth so sharp it threatens to sever you from the person you thought you were? David had left me with a blade like that. His threat wasn't a possibility. It was a promise. I sat in the profound silence of my father's office, staring at the stack of papers that now felt like a eulogy for my own righteous anger. The evidence was a perfect, beautiful weapon with a fatal design flaw. It was pointed as much at me and at everything I loved as it was at him. I had to get out. The walls felt like they were shrinking, the air thick with the ghost of my father's integrity and the stench of my uncle's pragmatism. I walked out into the afternoon sun, needing to feel the heat on my skin, to smell the living earth. I followed a familiar dirt path up a low hill, the dust clinging to my shoes. This was my father's canvas. Every vine, every row was a brushstroke, and David was threatening to set it all on fire, leaving me to be blamed for holding the match. Below me, near the crushing pad, I saw a small group of workers finishing for the day. Elena was among them, her movements slow and tired. They looked up as I approached, their faces etched with a familiar anxiety I was beginning to recognize. It was the look of people who know their world is balanced on a knife's edge. These weren't just employees. They were families who had measured their lives in Blackwood harvests. Some of them had worked this land since before I was born. Elena met me halfway, her eyes dark with concern. "Sofia," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The air is heavy today. People are worried. They see the storm between you and David." She didn't have to elaborate. In a place this small, tension was a weather front everyone could feel. One of the older vineyard hands, a man named Miguel whose father had worked for my grandfather, stepped forward. "Your father, he took care of us," he said, his English thick with a Spanish accent. "This place, it is our life. Please, do not let it die." His plea was a physical blow. They weren't asking for justice. They were asking for survival. They were begging me not to tear the whole thing down, even if it meant a monster remained in the house. They saw David for what he was, but they feared the chaos of his removal more than the quiet poison of his presence. They were asking me to choose their lives over my father's honor. Could I do that? Could I stand by and let David's corruption fester at the heart of Blackwood Estate just to keep the paychecks coming? I walked away from them, their pleading eyes burning into my back. I wandered aimlessly through the rows of Cabernet, the grapes hanging in heavy, dark clusters, almost ready for harvest. I stopped and touched a gnarled, ancient vine, one I knew my father had planted himself. I pressed my forehead against the rough bark. A wave of nausea and despair washed over me. To punish David, I would be punishing Miguel, and Elena, and a dozen others. To save them, I would be betraying my father, allowing his name to be attached to a lie. Both paths felt like a desecration. Both roads led to ruin. And I was standing alone at the crossroads, with no idea which way to turn. The despair of the crossroads lasted for 2 days. I was trapped in a state of suspended animation, paralyzed by 2 equally catastrophic futures. My uncle had built a perfect prison for me, where every move I made would trigger another's destruction. But on the 3rd morning, a different thought pierced through the fog. What if he was wrong? What if there wasn't just his way or my way? What if there was a third door he hadn't shown me? Rage is an emotional weapon, it's loud and messy, but the law is a scalpel. I realized I'd been trying to win a knife fight with my bare hands. I needed my own weapon. I drove 2 hours to a Sacramento high-rise, a sleek tower of glass and steel that felt a world away from the sun-drenched earth of Napa. The law office was a study in beige and muted tones, designed to project an aura of unshakable calm. The woman I was meeting, Amelia Albright, was a corporate litigator with a reputation for being a shark in a silk blouse. I didn't need a friend or a shoulder to cry on. I needed a shark. I needed someone who saw this not as a family tragedy, but as a hostile takeover that had already begun. She listened without interruption as I laid out the whole ugly story, spreading my printed evidence across her vast mahogany desk. Her face was impassive, her eyes sharp and analytical. She didn't offer sympathy, she offered focus. When I was done, she tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the incorporation document for Napa Valley Logistics. "His threat is credible," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. "A contested lawsuit would trigger loan covenants. The bankruptcy scenario he painted for you is not just possible, it's likely. He's boxed you in." It was terrifying to hear my fears confirmed so clinically. "So, what are my options?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "There are 2, she stated, leaning back. Option 1 is the scorched earth approach. We sue him, the business, everyone. It will be public, it will be filthy, and it will take years. You might win a moral victory in the end, but he will burn the vineyard to the ground on his way out. You'll be the queen of a pile of ash." Her bluntness was brutal, but it was exactly what I needed. "And option 2?" I pressed. "Option 2 is a buyout," she said. "You treat this like any other hostile partnership. You find the capital to purchase his 50% stake. You cut him a check, he signs a non-disclosure agreement, and he vanishes from your life and your business. It's clean. It's surgical. It saves the company. A sliver of hope, fragile but real, flickered in my chest. A way out. But then came the obvious, crushing question. Where would I get that kind of money? I have my share of the estate, but I have almost nothing in liquid assets. Amelia leaned forward, her expression turning purely strategic. Your share is your leverage. It's your only leverage. You need a partner, an investor who will loan you the capital for the buyout, with your 50% as collateral. My mind raced. An investor? Who? You could approach a competitor, she suggested, or a private equity firm that wants a foothold in Napa. But you must understand the risk. She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. To convince anyone to give you that much money, you'll have to show them these. She gestured to my evidence. You have to reveal that the business you're asking them to invest in has been systematically defrauded by your own partner. You're asking someone to buy into a house that is secretly on fire. I left her office with a clear path forward, but the path was paved with impossibilities. I was no longer trapped in an emotional maze. I was at the start of a strategic campaign against a man who had all the power. I had to find an ally willing to make an insane bet. A bet on me, a grieving daughter with no business experience, to save a damaged legacy from the man who was still legally in charge of it. The third door was there, but it was locked, and the key was in the pocket of an enemy I hadn't even met yet. Sometimes, the only way to honor a legacy is to break every rule your father ever taught you. My father had one cardinal rule: never trust Julian Thorne. Thorne was the enemy, the sleek corporate rival whose sprawling state-of-the-art winery on the next ridge was the antithesis of my father's artisanal, soulful approach. Theirs was a 30-year feud, a clash of philosophies fought over terroir and market share. Going to him for help felt like a profound betrayal, like asking the devil to finance a prayer. But my lawyer's words echoed in my mind. Your share is your only leverage. And I knew David would never see this coming. Thorne's estate was exactly as I'd pictured it. Architecturally stunning, impeccably landscaped, and utterly devoid of the messy, chaotic soul of Blackwood. It was a machine for making wine, efficient and impressive. I felt small and out of place walking into his glass-walled tasting room, the evidence against my own family tucked into a leather portfolio. I was a traitor walking into the enemy camp, preparing to offer up the secrets of my kingdom in exchange for a weapon. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of desperation. Julian Thorne was older than my father, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He had a reputation for being ruthless in business, but impeccably honest in his winemaking. He met me in his private office, a minimalist space with a single window that perfectly framed a view of my father's land. He didn't offer pleasantries. "Sofia," he said, his voice a low baritone. "I was sorry to hear about Marcus. He was a true artist. What can I do for you?" The directness was disarming. I took a breath and decided to match it. "Mr. Thorne, I'm here because Blackwood Estate is in trouble, and I believe you are the only person who can help me save it." Without waiting for a response, I opened the portfolio and laid the pages out on his desk. The two sets of books, the fake invoices, the proof of David's shell company. I explained the situation concisely, clinically, just as Amelia had coached me. I detailed David's theft and his threat of mutually assured destruction. I was showing the competitor the rot in our foundation, praying he would see an opportunity, not a liability. He listened, his steepled fingers hiding his mouth, his eyes scanning the documents. When I finished, he was silent for a full minute. I expected him to gloat, to savor the downfall of his rival's family. Instead, A look of profound, cold disgust settled on his face. "I am not surprised," he said finally, his voice tight with contempt. "I always respected your father even when we disagreed. He was a man of integrity. I despise men like your uncle. They aren't winemakers. They're bottom feeders who dilute the reputation of this entire valley for a quick profit." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at my home. Marcus deserved better. His legacy deserves better. He turned back to me, his gaze intense, analytical. He wasn't looking at a grieving daughter anymore. He was assessing a potential partner. "You have your father's eyes," he said, "and I suspect you have his backbone too. This is an incredible risk you're taking." He paused, the air crackling with tension. What was he going to say? Was this the end of the road? "Here is my offer," he said, his tone shifting to pure business. "I will provide you with a private loan sufficient to buy out your uncle's 50% share at a fair market valuation. But it will be a loan, not a gift. It will be secured by your own 50% share of the estate." The room seemed to tilt. He was saying yes. "That means," he continued, leaving no room for misunderstanding, "that if your business fails, if you cannot make the payments, I will own half of Blackwood Estate. You will lose everything. It's an enormous gamble, Sophia. Are you ready to make that bet?" I walked out of Julian Thorne's office feeling like I had just sold a piece of my soul. But what do you do when your soul is the only currency you have left? I had made the bet. The loan agreement, drafted by Amelia and countersigned by Thorne, felt impossibly heavy in my portfolio. It was my shield and my sword, but it was also a guillotine hanging over my own neck. For the first time since my father's death, however, I wasn't just reacting. I was acting. I was no longer a pawn in David's game. I was about to flip the entire board. I didn't seek him out in the privacy of the office. I found him in the grand tasting room, schmoozing with a pair of distributors. He was in his element, a picture of confident hospitality, pouring a glass of the very Pinot Noir that tasted of his lies. I waited, silent and still, until his guests had departed. He turned to me, his smile still lingering. "Sophia, to what do I owe the pleasure? Come to finally appreciate my business acumen?" His tone was light, but the jab was clear. He thought he had won. "I have a business proposal for you, David," I said, my voice as level and cool as the stone floor beneath my feet. I walked to the main tasting bar and laid a single, thick envelope on the polished oak. His smile tightened. He clearly wasn't expecting this. He picked it up, his movements slow, and pulled out the documents. It was a formal, legally binding offer to purchase his 50% share of Blackwood Estate. I watched him scan the first page, a flicker of genuine confusion in his eyes. Then he laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. It was a sharp, barking laugh of pure derision that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. "This is a joke, right?" he scoffed, tossing the papers onto the bar. "This is adorable. You and your little lawyer friend cooked this up?" "Sweetheart, you don't have the money to buy my share of the club membership at the local golf course, let alone this." The condescension was a thick, suffocating wave, but I stood my ground. I had anticipated this. "The valuation is fair and based on the last 3 years of earnings. The real earnings, not the ones you reported," I said calmly. "And the offer is fully financed." He laughed again, louder this time. "Financed by who? The Tooth Fairy?" He was enjoying this, the act of putting me back in my place. This was the moment, the final card, the one he would never see coming. I let the silence hang for a beat, drawing out his smug satisfaction. "I named a price, David, and I told you who is financing it. Julian Thorne." The name hit him like a physical blow. The laughter died in his throat. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed shock. He stared at me, his charming facade completely shattered, revealing the panicked, cornered animal beneath. Julian Thorne, the one man in the valley with the resources, the motive, and the personal animosity to see this through. He knew in that instant that I wasn't bluffing. This wasn't a desperate gamble from a grieving girl. This was a calculated execution. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a low, intense whisper, using his own tactics against him. You have 24 hours to accept this offer. You'll sign the papers, you'll take your money, and you will walk away from this valley forever. If you don't, that second door opens. The one that leads to my evidence being hand-delivered to the district attorney's office. You get a quiet, wealthy retirement, or you get a very public, very ugly trial. The choice is yours. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone with the offer, the silence of the room pressing in on him like the walls of a tomb. The 24 hours I gave him were the longest of my life. Every ring of the phone made my heart seize. Every passing car on the distant road sounded like his. He had two choices: a quiet exit with a fortune, or a public war that would destroy him. But what does a cornered narcissist do? Does he save himself, or does he try to burn his captor down with him? I had gambled everything on the belief that his greed and his cowardice were stronger than his hate. It was a terrifying bet to make on a man with no soul. The call came at the 23rd hour. It wasn't him. It was his lawyer. The voice was crisp, professional, and devoid of any human warmth. My client accepts your client's offer. We will meet at your counsel's office tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning to execute the documents. And that was it. No negotiation, no final, angry tirade. Just the cold, clipped sound of capitulation. He had chosen the money. I felt a wave of relief so profound it left me weak, but there was no joy in it. This wasn't a victory. It was an amputation. The signing was a sterile, silent affair in Amelia's Sacramento office. David was already there when I arrived, seated at the far end of the long conference table. He didn't look at me. He stared out the window at the city skyline, his face a mask of cold fury. We were no longer family. We were opposing parties in a transaction. The only sounds were the rustle of paper and the smooth, expensive click of Amelia's pen. When it was his turn to sign, his movements were precise, angry. He signed away his name, his history, his 50% of my father's life's work, with a firm, vicious stroke, as if he were carving his name into a gravestone. He didn't say a word as he left the office. I returned to the winery a few hours later, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the western ridge. His car was already gone. I walked into his office, the one that had always been his, not my father's. It was mostly empty. A single cardboard box sat on the floor, filled with a few personal effects. He had been surgically efficient in his departure. As I stood in the doorway, he came out of the main building carrying the box. He walked past me without a word, heading for his new car. Then he stopped and turned. He looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a look of such pure, distilled hatred that it felt like a physical blow. It was a look that promised nothing, but wished for everything bad. And then, he was gone. A strange, hollow silence settled over the estate. I had won. He was gone. The cancer was cut out. I walked out onto the veranda overlooking the vineyard. The vines were dark silhouettes against the twilight sky. It was all mine now. 100%. And so was the crushing, astronomical debt to Julian Thorne. So was the compromised quality of the last two vintages. So was the task of rebuilding the trust of my employees and the reputation of our brand. The victory I had fought so hard for suddenly felt like standing on the summit of a mountain in the middle of a hurricane, all alone. The battle against David was over, but the war to save Blackwood Estate had just begun. What happens after the monster is cast out? There is no victory parade, no applause. There is only the silence he leaves behind, a vacuum filled instantly by the crushing weight of what comes next. I stood in the aftermath of my uncle's exile, the sole owner of a name, a legacy, and a debt so large it felt like a physical presence, sitting on my chest and making it hard to breathe. The fight for justice was over. The fight for survival, I was quickly learning, was infinitely harder. The first few weeks were a blur of damage control. Elena and I spent 12-hour days in the cellar, tasting our way through every barrel from the last 2 years. It was a painful, methodical process, a post-mortem on my father's legacy. Some barrels were salvageable, others, tainted with the cheap, inferior grapes David had bought, were a lost cause. Pouring out thousands of dollars of unsellable wine felt like pouring my own blood onto the concrete floor, but it was a necessary sacrifice. My father's name would not go on a bottle of lies. Not anymore. The real work began in the fields. I traded my sommelier's blazer for work boots, and my wine key for pruning shears. I was out there every day, from sunrise to sunset, with Elena and the crew. I learned the ache of muscles I didn't know I had. I learned the language of the vines, the subtle curl of a leaf that signaled thirst, the precise way to thin the crop to concentrate the flavor in the remaining grapes. I wasn't their boss, I was their apprentice. And in their initial skepticism, I saw a challenge. To earn their trust not with my name, but with the sweat on my brow and the dirt under my fingernails. The summer was a relentless grind. Every decision was fraught with financial peril. Every new piece of equipment, every payroll, was a stark reminder of the loan from Julian Thorne, a guillotine suspended by the thinnest of threads. I met with distributors, my face burning with shame as I explained the inconsistencies of the last few vintages, and swore on my father's name that we were correcting the course. Some listened with pity, others with suspicion. But with every honest conversation, with every barrel of bad wine we refused to sell, a tiny bit of the stain was washed away. And then, the harvest came. A cool morning in late September. There was a different energy in the air, a nervous excitement that was electric. This wasn't just another harvest, it was a reclamation. This was our first crop, the one grown under my watch, nurtured with our own hands, free of David's shortcuts and lies. I stood on the hill as the sun rose, watching the picking crew move through the rows with a practiced, rhythmic grace. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight. Everything, the land, the legacy, my entire future, was riding on the quality of the fruit in those bins. Hours later, as the last rays of the sun painted the valley in hues of orange and deep purple, I stood on that same hill. The frantic energy of the day had subsided into a weary, satisfied calm. In my hand, I held a glass not of the new vintage, that was still just raw, fermenting juice, but of the last great Cabernet my father had made before he got sick. I raised the glass to the darkening sky, the wine a deep, honest crimson. I took a sip, and the familiar, complex notes of dark cherry, tobacco, and love filled my senses. I closed my eyes, and for the first time, I didn't feel the crushing weight of his absence. I felt his presence, a quiet, reassuring warmth beside me, as if he were standing right there, looking out over his legacy, finally cleansed. 2 years. Is that how long it takes to wash a place clean of its ghosts? Sometimes, standing on the hill at dusk, I still feel the echo of David's betrayal, a faint, bitter taste on the back of my tongue. But then I'll catch the scent of our new harvest on the breeze, and a different flavor takes over, the taste of hard-won survival. It's the taste of the wine that now sits on the top shelves of the finest restaurants in the country, a wine called Marcus's Legacy. The critics have been kind. They write about the return to form, The reclamation of a noble heritage. They don't know the half of it. They don't see the spreadsheets I stare at late into the night. The massive loan payment to Julian Thorne that looms over every decision. They don't know about the barrels of wine we poured down the drain, or the sleepless nights spent wondering if we would even make it to the next season. We are not saved, not yet. But we are standing. And we are fighting. The package arrived on a Tuesday in early October, a day like any other. It was a simple brown box with no return address, left on the porch of the main house. I assumed it was a sample from a new cork supplier or a bottle company. I almost left it for later, but a strange sense of curiosity made me bring it inside and slice open the tape with my pocket knife. Inside, nestled in a bed of wood shavings, was a single, dusty bottle of wine. My breath caught in my throat. I knew this bottle. It was a 1997 Reserve Cabernet, a vintage my father had made in a year everyone else had written off. He had made only 2 barrels, calling it his miracle wine. It was a legend in our cellar, a piece of family history I thought was long gone, consumed by time and special occasions. It was priceless, not because of its monetary value, but because it was a bottled memory of my father at his most brilliant and defiant. Tucked beside the bottle was a small, plain white card. My hands trembled as I picked it up. There were only 5 words on it, written in a strong, unfamiliar hand. He would be proud of you. I sank into the nearest chair, the card clutched in my hand, tears blurring the simple, powerful words. I read them again and again, each reading a wave of warmth washing over the bruised and battered parts of my soul. It was the benediction I never knew I was waiting for. I have no idea who sent it. Was it Julian Thorne, a gesture of respect from a former rival who had become a silent, watchful partner in my survival? Was it Elena, who had found one last bottle hidden away in a forgotten corner of the cellar? Or was it an old friend of my father's, someone watching from afar? In the end, I realized it didn't matter. The message wasn't from a single person. It was from the world he had built, a world that understood the difference between a shortcut and the long, hard road home. I didn't open the bottle. I placed it on the mantel in his old office, beside a picture of him smiling, his face crinkled by the sun. It's a reminder. A reminder that I didn't just save a business from a thief, I saved a story. I chose the most difficult path, the one paved with risk and uncertainty, because it was the only one that led back to the truth. And in doing so, I had not only honored my father's legacy, I had finally, truly, made it my own.